The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued a new eviction moratorium on August 3rd that extends the halt on evictions in counties experiencing high COVID transmission rates. FYI, 80% of U.S. counties met the metric of high transmission in a country where half the population roughly is now vaccinated, which was not the case the first time we did this entire thing. That initial moratorium went into effect on September 4th of last year. This new one expires allegedly on October 3rd, meaning some renters have been given now more than a year's grace for paying their rent. Now, they're not off the hook for the back rent, but in the meantime, property owners are not getting a break on their mortgage or their property taxes and other expenses that one naturally occurs when they rent out their property. I have some feelings about this as well as some questions. So in the spirit of Better Call Saul, I thought, why not phone a lawyer? I spoke with Steve Simpson, a senior attorney at the Pacific Legal Foundation. So Steve, point blank, is the second round of the eviction moratorium legal?
No. At least not in my opinion. And I think the Supreme Court would agree with me, and that's part of the reason I say that. Not too long ago, a couple of weeks or so ago, the Supreme Court ruled on what's known as a stay motion coming out of a D.C. Circuit Court. The plaintiffs in that case, landlords challenging the eviction moratorium, tried to lift a stay imposed by the court. And while the Supreme Court denied that motion, allowing basically, which would have prevented the CDC from enforcing the eviction moratorium, 4 justices dissented from that denial. And Justice Kavanaugh wrote separately to say, in his view, the CDC moratorium is not authorized by the statute, which is what those of us who've been challenging this law for over a year now have been arguing, that the law at issue doesn't authorize the eviction moratorium. So it's pretty clear that if this case goes back to the Supreme Court, 5 justices are going to rule against the Biden administration.
So I've heard the thing about Brett Kavanaugh sort of dissenting a couple of times, and I guess this gets into the area where there's so much that happens at the federal government level that is in fact illegal, but it just sort of happens anyway.
And that is true, unfortunately.
And it makes me wonder, it's like, so you have this thing that the CDC does that is obviously extra legal, but then it still happens anyways. So how is recourse delivered to the people who have been wronged in this case, which in this case is property owners who are not getting rent for their property? Yeah,
I mean, there are really only a couple things they can do. One is they can challenge, and they can just keep pushing to see if we can get a case back to the Supreme Court to get them to hold, to say essentially this is illegal and you have to stop. And that's happening right now on an emergency basis. A lot of people are trying to push this case to the courts. The second thing that I think will happen not long after the initial round of litigation on the moratorium is done is I think a lot of people will be bringing what's known as takings claims, arguing that this is a taking of property without compensation, and then they'll be seeking compensation from the federal government.
Where does the takings clause come from?
Takings clause is part of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, and it says private property shall not be taken without just compensation, essentially.
So I know, like, on principle, you're opposed to an action like this, where an eviction moratorium gets placed, renters do not have to pay their landlords, and I guess eventually they owe tons and tons of back rent. I'm against this on principle too, but when it comes down to implementation, there's a part of me that also goes like, if this were to happen, it would need to be done through Congress. The House shirked their responsibility and kicked it over to Biden as if it was his problem. AOC, Cori Bush, they all advocated for this. There's a part of me that goes like, all right, if you want to have a socialist society, go for it, but you're going to have to pass it through Congress and make it law. Does that make a difference in the way that you view this, or is it just flat out wrong and illegal no matter which way you do it?
No, it makes a huge difference. In fact, the lawsuit that we brought 2 lawsuits. Both of those lawsuits basically attack the statutory basis of the eviction moratorium. And our argument is pretty simple. The law that they're operating under, a law called the Public Health Services Act, passed in the 1940s, allows certain kinds of things by, say, the CDC to prevent cross-border transmission of disease, inspection, disinfection, et cetera. I always think of it as they can disinfect rail cars, right? They can destroy infected animals and plants and that kind of thing. And that's a law that's, 80 years old by this point. They're allowed to, they're allowed to do a lot of things under that. but they are not allowed to control evictions nationwide. And our view and our arguments—
It's really scary. The CDC making housing policy.
No, absolutely. And not just housing policy for, let's say, a handful of people, but for the entire country. Shutting down local courts nationwide, that is utterly outrageous, and it's clearly not what Congress intended by this law. So our view is simple. Hey, if Congress wants to do that, let Congress take the responsibility for it. Let them take the political hit if there's going to be a political hit. Let them take the political accolades if they're going to be political accolades. But that's how the system is supposed to work. That's what accountable representative government is all about.
What kind of market backlash do you see being in the cards for an action such as this? Because what I have seen already, I've talked to a couple of landlords who I know, and when I say landlords, I'm not talking about bourgeois landowners, but like 30-year-olds who finally were able to put a little bit of an investment into one of their old apartments when they move on to their first homes. And they are running into the situation of it is more profitable for them, profitable in air quotes, to not even have a tenant at all and to leave their buildings completely empty as long as the eviction moratorium is in place. And you think about that on top of the thing like the housing shortage, the housing crunch, the people not being able to get roofs over their head.
Right.
Obviously that there is an unseen effect here that the left who has pursued this policy, again in air quotes, are not willing to look at or consider.
Yeah, I mean, the market backlash is anytime you put a restriction, a government-imposed restriction on this, it cascades down the line, and there's all kinds of reverberations through the market. And yeah, one of them is that landlords will come to realize it just doesn't make sense for me to keep renting if I'm not going to be able to collect rent, because actually having tenants in the apartments actually costs me money, right? And I have employees to pay off.
I tore up my last apartment. The walls, like,
yeah, I mean,
I was a bad renter. Like, I put so many holes in the wall, damage, and then I just kind of like spackled it and got out of there.
That's right.
But like, someone has to repaint that.
No kidding.
Like,
and
that's
somebody has to
recouped costs.
That's absolutely right. Somebody has to take out the garbage. Somebody has to make sure the toilet's flush. Somebody has to make sure there's water to the building. Somebody has to make sure all of those things. And if you're just going to have people living and now they have no reason to care whatsoever because they're not, they know they're not going to be able to pay rent or have to pay rent later on, the landlords are basically hung out to dry.
I know, I think it goes without saying that you're sympathetic to people who are finding themselves without a stream of income, unable to pay their rents, or straight up just losing their homes and livelihoods as a result of the pandemic. We all know somebody who is living on the edge right now with the way that things have been. We live in a sort of protected media class and legal class, and we'll always have work to do, and that is really great for us, but that's just not the case for everybody else. Were there alternatives here? Were there other things that could have been done besides like passing this through Congress to take away people's property rights? Was there something else that could have been done to make sure that people are not living out on the streets and spreading the virus as a result? Which is still a premise I kind of question.
There's a ton of things that they could have done. I mean, one would just have been take part of the $1 trillion that they sent, checks to people, the so-called stimulus, and actually target people who are having a difficult time paying rent. Get that money directly to them or pay it directly to the landlords. Have those people apply for assistance directly from the beginning of the pandemic. Don't just tell landlords you can't evict anybody. Part of the problem with an eviction moratorium is now landlords have no incentive or ability even, because it outlaws any kind of contact with the renters. I mean, it's an extraordinary ban. It says any action that you take that could lead to the eviction.
It's legalized squatting.
No, absolutely. It is absolutely that. And landlords were terrified when it came down. Now, you know as well as I do that if you're a landlord and your tenant can't pay, you're going to try to negotiate with them. You're going to try to work with them. It took all that off the table, which has, I think, just created exactly the concern with the tidal weight of evictions that everybody is now screaming about.
How long can something like this actually go on? Because there's going to be new strands of COVID for the foreseeable future. They've told us over and over and over again that we should get used to living with this thing. There's going to be Lambda, Delta, Beta, whatever strain of coronavirus, which makes me think there will always be spread.
Yeah.
Right now, the spread that the CDC is looking at covers 80% of U.S. counties. The entire United States map is pretty much red, as in numbers are going up, not for COVID hospitalizations or deaths, but simply spread of the illness. this gives the CDC license to do this forever, unless someone stops it.
And logically, their argument basically is if people are evicted, they may end up coming into contact with somebody else that may spread the disease across state lines. Of course, that is how a pandemic ends up spreading, right? I mean, it is necessarily one person spreading to another and then people crossing state lines, and then you go from an outbreak to a pandemic. So their argument implicitly is we can control every human interaction in the entire country under this law. So from the standpoint that you're asking it can go on forever unless the courts step in or somebody has the good sense to say, hey, we have to put a limit on this. My concern is once we've gone down this road of the notion being that the government is going to prevent or protect us from any possible risk from COVID, not deal with real emergency situations, but any possible risk from COVID, the cat's out of the bag in a sense, and we're just going to continue to follow this until somebody has the good sense to say no
That's
more.
because this is a Christmas wish list item for the squad, the Democratic Socialists in Congress, who it needs to be said that while they are seizing on this opportunity to make this case, they have always believed that housing is a right.
Absolutely.
They have always been reading their Marx diligently, and they believe that property owners of any kind are committing some sort of moral sin or outrage.
Right.
They don't believe in property rights as a concept. They're going to argue this tomorrow, next month, and next year, that people need to be giving up their properties so that everybody has a house over their head, no matter who gets hurt in the process.
Yeah, and we saw exactly those people the minute the pandemic hit go and sort of dust off a bunch of proposals that they've had sitting on a shelf somewhere for many years, anti-landlord, supposedly pro-tenant, although I don't think these things are really pro-tenant. They just dusted them off, pulled them off a shelf, and said, hey, now it's time to institute eviction moratoriums across the country. So it's really disingenuous in addition to being illegal.
So I want to ask you a big, loaded, slippery slope question because I'm concerned about this on a real level. If the CDC, Michelle Lewinsky, can pass a measure like this under the guise of it being public health related, the seizure of people's properties to actually house and quarter people during this pandemic, which is going to grind on forever, again, under the guise of it being a public health purpose. What is stopping the CDC from also taking action on the thing that they have labeled a public health issue, such as gun violence, and calling for some sort of mandate on local law enforcement to take people's guns?
Right.
What is stopping the CDC in some dystopian future, 2040, actually taking an action like that? Because this is like a shoot first, ask lawyers later kind of situation where, why not?
I think ultimately public opinion, and it's ideas and public opinion. And if you continue, if people get more and more used to this kind of thing happening, and courts aren't willing to step in and say, this is illegal and they cannot do this, which is part of what PLF is trying to do here, is prompt courts and prompt everybody to see that this is a vast overstep of their authority, then I think more and more people get used to it, and over time, if they think they can get away with it in the future, such as the type of thing that you just talked about, which Andrew Cuomo, by the way, in New York, already announced a gun emergency, and now we're going to use emergency powers to try to go after. I mean, we've heard this kind of thing for many years. The war on this, the war on that. This is an emergency, that's an emergency. Environmental issues, whatever, social issues. It's all a question at this point of, do people get used to it, and are they willing to, look aside and say, yeah, let them do this, because after all, it's an emergency.
Well, I appreciate you joining the fight and saying no as much as you can in your capacity at Pacific Legal Foundation. Steve Simpson, thanks so much.
Thank you.